want to welcome you to COVID-19 and Constitutionality Simplified. With that, I'll hand it over to Jonathan.
All right. Yellow fever, cholera, Spanish flu, H1N1, and now COVID-19. What do each of these things have in common? Well, they're all viruses that have affected America in significantly proportionate manners, yet the way America has treated them, and more importantly, treated COVID-19 and past viruses, they're two very different responses. So today, what we're going to try to learn is what the government has done in the past, how COVID has affected America, what a state of emergency is, and the constitutionality of shutting down. So the first thing that we're going to look at is, like I said, what the government has done in the past. So let's take a look at the yellow fever.
Yellow fever was a very interesting pandemic, and simply because it was the closest pandemic to the time that the Constitution was formulated. So if there was really any time to determine how the founding fathers would have acted in a pandemic such as today, it would have been the yellow fever. So that's why we chose to specifically talk about this one. So the yellow fever occurred in 1793. The epicenter of the virus was in Philadelphia. So 5,000 individuals died from this virus. Do keep in mind that in this time, America was much smaller than it is today, but that equated to about 10% of the population within the city itself. 17,000 individuals fled from Philadelphia, which was about 34% of the population within the city. And something interesting to note was the only government leader that got involved with the pandemic or really regulating anything during this time was the mayor of Philadelphia, the localized mayor. So Jonathan and I were talking about this yesterday, and it was pretty interesting. Philadelphia is kind of comparable to New York with COVID-19 today. It was the epicenter of the virus. Sure, it was a little bit here, a little bit there, but it was primarily in Philadelphia. So the only person that really did anything about it was the mayor of Philadelphia. Some of the things that he did was he limited travel outside of the city, and the sick were quarantined, but even then they weren't even forced to be quarantined, which was pretty interesting. So if we want to look at the differences between this virus and what we are experiencing, they're such. So nobody was forced to stay home, like we mentioned, unless sick, and even then they weren't forced to. And churches remained open the entire time. There was one point where one individual asked a church, and they said, why are you, well, they pretty much just suggested maybe restricting their meetings or their degree of intimacy. And when asked about it, the church said this: to have changed the time or place of the meeting would have been a haughty attempt to escape the wrath of God, from which there was no escape. This was a very powerful response, even in considering the fact that this was a very powerful virus. So I wanted to share that because I thought it was kind of interesting. So that being said, let's go ahead and skip a few decades and look at the next virus, the H1N1. Or not the cholera is the next one.
There we go. All right. So cholera took place in a very significant period of time. So there were other viruses that actually took place between the yellow fever and cholera, but why we chose this one was because it took place in a very significant constitutional aspect of America, aka the Civil War. This was a time where the Constitution was actually being rewritten to try to work other things, and yet still we can tell that their view of the Constitution was a little bit different than what it has become today. So cholera killed about 75,000 people, a little bit less of that, and that was equivalent to 0.579% of the entire population of the United States. Now, once again, you may be thinking that's a really small number, and yet it's even higher than what the coronavirus has killed in America today, with that being only 104,000, and that's equivalent to about 0.029% death rate from coronavirus. Now, as time went on, the government essentially just began to create safer sewage treatment and cleaner public restrooms, which actually led to the eradication of the disease in its entirety. Now, notice that down here in the white, next to no government interference came into play at all. In fact, nobody was forced to stay home. Quarantines were rare, if even happening. No rights were taken except to keep things sanitary, which I think we can all agree and actually is what led to the eradication of cholera in the United States. So when we keep that in mind, especially in today, it seems to appear that once we just recognize that sanitation and good hygiene are important to a healthy body, oftentimes we don't need government interaction. But not only that, but churches, once again, continue to hold services the entire time, and they never even considered closing down during any of this period at time. In fact, it was so uncommon for people to even care about the cholera outbreak that really just it eventually disappeared and was just eradicated, and we've not had to deal with it in significant portions here in the United States ever since. So with that, we're actually going to talk about the Spanish flu, and we're going to skip forward about a century.
So the Spanish flu was probably the worst pandemic that the United States has ever faced. It killed 675,000 individuals, which equated to about almost 7% of the population. In the United States, the Committee of the American Public Health Association, they issued measures to limit large gatherings, kind of like what we saw today, but instead it wasn't from the federal government itself, it was rather like a bureaucracy kind of. So non-essential meetings were prohibited, things like public funerals, which is pretty interesting, saloons, cinemas, other non-essential gatherings like that. And the difference, though, between the Spanish flu in 1918 to COVID-19 today was that schools still stayed open. They remained open during this time because schools were seen to be one of the most essential gatherings in our nation. Churches were also allowed to remain open because of that same mindset. The committee believed that only minimum services should be conducted, but even then, it was never a requirement and it was never enforced. It was just a recommendation. In the United States, the biggest difference was that the United States had a more constitutional approach to the way that they went about the recommendations and the way that they went about the regulation with regards to the pandemic as a whole. So that being said, now let's take a look at the H1N1, which is probably the most recent other than COVID.
Exactly. Like Karina said, this is the most recent pandemic we've had, obviously before COVID-19. And honestly, though, the fact that this is considered a pandemic, especially in America, is kind of interesting. Only 0.0041% of the population of the United States died. So only 12,000 people out of roughly 300-something million Americans died from the H1N1, and yet it was still considered a pandemic. And yet all of us that were alive during that time probably don't even recall any changes in our lives from this situation. I personally lived through it as well. I was 9 years old and going to school. Nothing ever changed in my life. I didn't even know that this was an issue that was being faced during the time. But never mind the fact that, let's look at what the federal government or just governments in general were doing. They never used the national Tamiflu stockpile. They didn't close the border with Mexico. They only decided to provide clear news and advice on their government websites like the CDC or even flu.gov. And once again, there were no mandatory vaccines for this. And once again, the differences that we can see here is that schools stayed open. The disease wasn't really viewed as a massive threat requiring shutdowns of the country. It affected 60.8 million people in America. And yet, like we can see here, life never changed. Only 12,000 out of that 60.8 million died, and shutdowns weren't required. And last, but certainly not least, churches weren't forced to shut down, and they stayed open. They were barely even pressured to do any kind of changes. So when we recognize how really it's only been about 11 years and all of a sudden we see all of these differences and what has occurred, it kind of calls into question what's going on. But regardless, let's actually talk about the virus that we're facing today.
So let's fast forward 11 years to the present day, COVID-19. So if you didn't know, COVID-19 is caused by a coronavirus called SARS-CoV-2. A little story I always like to share is this semester I was actually in a class about leading through disasters, and my professor, we would always talk about this specific epidemic. At that time it was an epidemic in China, and we talked a lot about the source of the virus, different theories about the source of the virus, how the virus came to be, and different things like that. And it was really funny because we'd never expected it to affect us in this capacity. We always expected it to stay within the borders of China or maybe some of the countries closest to it. So fast forward to now, it's very interesting having done a lot of that brainstorming and evaluation before it actually affected America to this degree. So that being said, I got to use a little bit of my research from then. It's a small amount, but you could probably find it anywhere on Google by this point. So it's caused by SARS-CoV-2. It affects the respiratory system, but I don't have to tell you that. You probably already know most of this. It originated in Wuhan, China, and there are a plethora of different theories about how it originated. The most commonly believed one is that it originated from a bat sold at a seafood market. This is a practice that is commonly done in China. However, there are some speculations regarding this theory because there were some people that had the virus early on that cannot be traced back to the seafood market. So there's different theories. No one knows which one's for sure, but that's the most highly believed one. So talking about its effect on the American people, like Jonathan said, it's only affected 0.02% of the population within the United States. That's a very small number, but they'll only tell you that it's killed about 104,000 individuals. When we look at the greater scope of the population within America, that we have about 300 million roughly is what Jonathan said. So it's very interesting looking at those proportions in comparison to the other viruses that we recently just talked about. It's a very small proportion with a lot of government regulation. So let's dive into exactly the type of government regulations that we've seen. So like we've said, we don't want to downplay the gravity or the effect of the deaths at all. They're very tragic, like any death is. So there have been about 1.8 million cases and 104,000 deaths, which we should all take very seriously. It's a very serious situation. But let's evaluate what the government has done about it. The federal government suspended entry into the United States from many countries. And like we evaluated before, the government's never done that. Even with regards to the recent H1N1, we never closed the borders. President Trump officially declared a national emergency. We're going to get into the state of emergency, what exactly that means, but he pretty much did this so that he could get access to funding. The federal government advised gatherings of no more than 10 people, and this wasn't forced, but originally it was 15 and it went down to 10, and this was per the recommendation of the CDC. The federal government committed a $2 trillion economic stimulus package, so some individuals did receive a stimulus check, and I know I did, and it was great. President Trump released a 3-phase plan for reopening. And this is something that we did cover earlier, so we're not going to really get into the nitty-gritty of it. If you're interested in learning more about the 3-phase plan, we do have an article on our website written by my incredible future sister-in-law, Beth. She is in here now. All right, so let's look at what the states have done. So something that I do want to point out, and I'll let Jonathan speak about this one, but something that is important is that our government is broken up into 3 levels. And I always stress this because I always hear people say, oh gosh, President Trump, oh gosh, Governor Newsom. We need to consider that it may not necessarily be the governor, it may not necessarily be the president, it may not even necessarily be your local government. There's 3 different layers. Each layer of government does different things. The states have what we call police powers, and they're very different from what the federal government is authorized to do. So that is why a lot of states have reopened, while a lot of other states are still slowly getting there. California, talking to you. But so this is why we're going to talk about this, what the state has done specifically. So I'll let Jonathan touch on that.
So obviously this is more of a matter of what some states have done. This is not what every single state has done, because if we were doing that, we would have 50 different presentations just regarding states. But some of the things that states have done, and in fact many of them have done this, they place specified restrictions on gatherings of anywhere between 10 to 50 people. They required face masks. They closed all non-essential businesses, and usually they determined essentiality based off of the CDC's guidelines for what an essential business was. Although some states have changed it themselves, and some states also, I mean, they are not required to abide by that, as Karina was saying, that those are just guidelines. They've also, some states have drafted stay-at-home orders, which essentially just stated don't go outside of your house unless required or unless it was necessary. And then also the last thing, and this is probably the most recent, is that many states are beginning the reopening process and have begun to repeal these orders. Once again, if you read about President Trump's plans for reopening, which was written by my sister, you can actually check and see what your state has been doing in the situation, which phases they're in, and what those different phases are and how they actually affect what's going on in the area. Now you may be asking though, why are states allowed to do this? Where does the Constitution fit into all this? And we'll get specifically into that. But one of the things that actually is written in there is this idea of a state of emergency. This is what many states and the federal government have declared. So with that, we're going to actually talk about what a state of emergency is. So as the Supreme Court said, and this was found in 1917, an emergency may not call into life a power which has never lived, but emergency may afford a reason for the exertion of a living power already enjoyed. So this was something that the Supreme Court decided was constitutional regarding emergency powers. And what it's essentially saying is that it's not going to necessarily bring forth power that has never come into place before. It's not going to bring into power something that hasn't already been drafted in law, meaning that a state that hasn't already declared that they're allowed to do something during a state of emergency, or if the federal government hasn't already declared this before, it's not like all of a sudden they can just start doing something that's never been discussed about before. But essentially, it's going to allow a reason. It's going to allow these governments to do things that are essentially meant to be for the betterment of the people. And as we go through specifically the federal and the state emergency powers, we're going to recognize that most of these things were meant to be there for the people themselves. It wasn't meant to necessarily give the government more power, but instead it was to be for the benefit of them. So first, let's talk about what a federal state of emergency is. So one of the things that the federal government is allowed to do whenever they declare a national emergency is that it allows the federal government to provide resources to states. Now, this can be done in many different ways. It can be in the form of financial aid, personnel, services, logistical and technical assistance, tons of different resources the federal government has and how they're able to provide those resources to the state. Now, the second thing that this does is it actually triggers emergency provisions in other laws. Now, obviously I can explain that, but it actually leads to this third thing of easing requirements on individuals, organizations, and local governments. So examples of this are usually don't actually apply to us as Americans or just as the average citizen. Most of them have to do with like the waiving of provisions of, HIV healthcare services programs, or the Secretary of Health is able to waive certain provisions as necessary to supply public health services. Most of these things aren't affecting the average American, but that shows why whenever the federal government declares a national emergency, it's not something to be incredibly concerned about. Usually it's meant to work with these other businesses in order to help them or to be able to provide funding for other states. It's not necessarily saying that, oh my gosh, every state needs to be in lockdown, things are terrible, but it's there to actually help the states, because that's what the federal government was there for, was to be able to help them whenever they needed it. Now, the fourth and final thing is just the fact that it activates other emergency response protocols and systems. And so these can be things like the National Response Framework or the National Incident Management System. Once again, these aren't necessarily affecting the average American, but it's just saying that, hey, if we declare this, we're going to have the ability to send money or other resources that are needed. We're going to try to make it easier on these businesses that are actually like not able to do these things during this time. And we're going to make sure that we have systems in place to be able to respond adequately to what's going on. So essentially, the federal state of emergency is just about money and making life easier. It's not meant to make things harder. And that's what a lot of people don't understand whenever they hear that, Trump or whoever the president is declared a national state of emergency. They get scared about it because it sounds like a big deal. But at the end of the day, whenever a federal government is doing it, it's actually not going to hurt anyone, thankfully. Now let's talk about what a state of emergency is.
So the purpose of the state, it's very similar to the federal state of emergency. Like we mentioned earlier, they're two different things, but I'll go ahead and just go down the line here. So the activation of state of emergency response, it's just mutual aid agreements. It's very simple. The authority to expend funds and deploy personnel, supplies, stockpiles, essentially to allocate resources just like the federal government does, but at a more local level. Because let's just, every state needs different things. So what New York needs is probably not what California needs. It's probably not what Texas needs. So by activating a state of emergency within your state, your governor is able to allocate specific resources for your specific counties within the state. It suspends and waives rules and regulations and statutes if allowed. So there is a danger in calling a state of emergency because it gives the governor, the executive branch altogether, a lot of power. It gives them a lot of power and a lot of maneuvering within the laws, and that's kind of what we've been seeing today, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. And it streamlines state administrative procedures, so it just makes things quicker, easier to go about. It kind of eliminates the middleman. I hate to say it, but and the middleman being that our government is brilliantly designed so that things can take long, or things can be a little bit harder whenever they affect a vast amount of people, so that we don't have corrupt laws, we don't have corrupt individuals representing us, we don't have corrupt judges. There are a lot of steps that you have to go through in order to get certain things out of our government. But a state of emergency kind of removes a lot of those regulations, a lot of those timeframes, so that things can move quicker, which can be a good thing, like when there's an earthquake and we really need money and we really need people here and there, or a bad thing. So again, the majority of the state of emergency is pretty much just to help people and to get money.
Exactly. And so on that, we're actually going to start talking about essentially the constitutionality of what's been going on. Now, we're going to look at both sides here because, in fact, there are arguments for both sides regarding it. So why do we care, though, about the constitutionality? Well, because the Constitution actually gives itself a section, and it's found in Article 4, that the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land, and essentially the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Now that's a long-winded way of essentially saying that, hey, the Constitution is the most important document that we have concerning government here in America. Therefore, every state has to abide by it. So therefore, we need to recognize if what's being done is constitutional, tells us if it's something that's actually allowed to be done here in America. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the pro-shutdown, or essentially why shutdowns are legal or right. Now I'm going to try to stay away from moral arguments, purely because we're trying to look at this from a constitutional, unbiased perspective of what the law actually says. So one of the most important things is that, well, the police power of the states has been invoked on multiple occasions by the Supreme Court. Not only that, but in the 2012 Obamacare case, Chief Justice Roberts, in his opinion, actually stated this very thing. So we can only have to go back 8 years to our Supreme Court. Most of the justices, which are already still there, agreed with the idea that states have this ability of police power. So whenever a state has this police power, it legitimately includes such regulations as needed to protect the public health. Now this was found in a 1905 Supreme Court case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And this was involving vaccination laws, but essentially what they were saying is that if a state has these police powers, well, they're allowed to actually do such things that are needed to protect the public health.
Let me go ahead and simplify that. So essentially what he's saying, if you guys remember, we have 3 branches of government. We have the executive branch, we have the judicial branch, and we have the legislative branch. And each of these branches are found at the state and the federal level of government. And so when we're looking at, when he's mentioning that the Supreme Court made a ruling on something, when a Supreme Court makes a ruling, it pretty much, it's law. It's something that we can look back to and justify our laws or justify our actions if we were the government per se. In the present time. So when he's talking about the Obamacare case, the Supreme Court said that states have the authority to, that's really fun. Someone just highlighted on that. The states have the authority to essentially do anything that would protect the health of people. And that's what we were talking about with the vaccination law, with the vaccination case. So they have the power to, it's a police power, that's what we were talking about earlier with the states, to regulate or to give, make and enforce a law that would protect the health of the people, which is why, like Jonathan was saying, these shutdowns can be considered legal.
Exactly. And so in regards to protecting the public health, that leads into this third point of extreme uncertainty was used to justify the extreme action. So as we know, at the beginning of the crisis, there was little data available. And the data that we were given was essentially telling us that everything was going to be very terrible from this virus. Not only that, but there were possibilities of millions of additional deaths if draconian measures, or basically just extreme, intense measures, were not immediately imposed. But what that's saying is that they thought terrible things were going to be happening. And because there was no certainty about it, they felt that it's better to be safer than sorry. So we might as well shut down in this situation and use our police powers, because it's going to be, at the end of the day, protecting the public health from what we expect to happen. And then the reason why a lot of people are believing that shutdowns are still a good idea is because it's still an unknown virus. And we have a duty as a nation to protect everyone until we have all of the details. That's their belief in the system, and that's the belief of why these shutdowns are actually for the betterment of the nation, is because if we were to reopen and everything was to go terribly, well, then all of a sudden we would be to blame for having reopened too soon. And that's why they want to make sure that we fully understand what's going on with this virus in order to be able to reopen in a safe and effective measure.
So because there is so much uncertainty, the states justify the measures being taken by the fact that they need to protect the health of their people. That's essentially what it all comes down to. So let's take a look at the anti-shutdown arguments here. So anti-shutdown. So laissez-faire, it's a principle that our nation kind of endorses. It's more of a conservative principle from an economic standpoint, but it has some merit. So governments can't force individuals to do something. That's like what our nation was founded upon. Yeah. So they can punish people for wrong actions. They can intentionally harm someone, like murder, stealing, or assault, but they cannot punish you for pursuing your life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness. And by they, I mean government. So there's a lot of leeway within those words if we're looking at this from a constitutional perspective. The second point here being the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So for this point, I want to point back to the yellow fever. In the beginning, thank you, whoever is highlighting. In the beginning, when this virus outbroke, and again, it was, I believe it was 1793, and our Constitution was created in 1788, and it was, ratified in 1788. So that virus is essentially the pinnacle of what the Founding Fathers would have endorsed if we were to have experienced a pandemic. In that time, they never closed anything down. Churches remained open, businesses remained open. The sick were quarantined, but it was never forced. They were all recommendations. And so when we're looking at the First Amendment, that's exactly what it's saying. No law shall prohibit the free exercise of your religion, shall prohibit the freedom of your speech or of the press. And again, that's not really entirely relevant. Or again, this is the big one here, or the right of people to peaceably assemble. Now, the biggest thing here is there's a lot of leeway in the word peaceably. So that I've heard some people say, well, is it really peaceful if you might contract a deadly virus? There's grounds for both. I mean, like, let's look at the statistics again. 0.02%. I would say that that's a pretty peaceful assembly, considering you have a 0.02% of dying from this virus, and considering the fact that 97% of the people that contract the virus, might even be higher. I'll check on that. They do recover. But regardless, let's move on to the third one. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. I'm sorry. Nowhere in the Constitution it doesn't mention the word health or pandemic. So there's never an exception in the Constitution. We never see that. It's always no, no, no. And if the Founding Fathers, trust me, they were very smart. They went through a lot. If they felt that it was necessary to include an exception clause, they most certainly would have done so. But they made it very clear, no. So that's essentially the constitutional argument on that side. And I'll let Jonathan kind of talk about the article.
And real quick, and now a question that people may have is that if you've ever read the Constitution, which I highly recommend every single person here reads, if you're a United States citizen, or if you just even love this country and want to see what a good governing document is, I highly recommend at least reading it once all the way through. But in what's considered the preamble, which is literally just kind of the introductory paragraph, there's this word in there that kind of says promote the general welfare is the idea behind the government. And so a lot of people will ask, well, what about, the idea of promoting the general welfare? Doesn't health kind of fall into that? And honestly, that's kind of how it's been translated or kind of taken in more recent years. But actually, as shown in the United States versus Butler, this statement is solely referring, and when I say United States versus Butler, I mean that it's a Supreme Court decision, meaning, as Karina said before, it's essentially the law of the land, or at least it's the ruling of the land when interpreting the Constitution. This statement is solely referring to the idea of taxation when using this statement. It is not in our government's authority to make laws that go against other aspects of the Constitution for the general public health of America. In fact, this was a Supreme Court case done in 1936, so it's not just my word that's saying it. It's 9 other justices that read the Constitution and actually agreed that when reading this idea of the general welfare, what was intended behind it was the idea of taxation. So like this third point is saying, that there's nowhere in the Constitution where the mention of the word health or pandemic show why any of these rights should not be allowed to be utilized. So the entire First Amendment that's placed here still stands, at least in the ideas of the founders, and of what the Constitution was intended to say.
And I do want to point this out because I've also heard this argument. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. And I've heard some people justify it. Well, it wasn't Congress. It was Governor Newsom. It was, what have you. The Supreme Court has upheld multiple times that no government agency, no level of government can restrict your constitutional freedoms. So that argument doesn't stand. I also want to let Jonathan talk about the specific article of the Constitution.
Regarding
it was so for the let's go ahead and touch on the second point here, which was the First Amendment again. So the 6th article of the Constitution, essentially what we just want to mention is it also backs up the First Amendment. They're saying almost the same thing, or roughly it backs up the points that we're trying to make within, or these points that we're trying to talk about why shutdowns are illegal. So if you have time, like Jonathan mentioned, read the Constitution. Specifically, these 2 portions are very relevant to what we're experiencing. So do you have anything more to say in regards to those 2 points?
I think that we're ready to conclude.
All right, let's shut it down. Haha. Wish you guys were able to laugh at that, but that's okay. So let's go ahead. I'm going to open it up for questions in just a little bit, but we'll just go ahead and quickly sum up what we talked about today. So what we talked about, we'll go ahead and come back to this other slide actually. Yep, perfect. So we discussed how the government has dealt with previous pandemics. We kind of highlighted the very big differences between what has happened before, what is happening now. We highlighted the difference between the numbers before and the numbers now. We highlighted and kind of just broke down the general gist of COVID-19 in that. We talked about what a state of emergency was. We broke that down for you and simplified it. And we also simplified both sides for the constitutional arguments for and against. So that being said, thank you so much for joining us in our first online institute. It was an absolute pleasure to be able to host this. We're really excited and we hope to be able to continue doing this in the future. I started this organization when I was 16 because I saw a need for an understanding of a basic government principles, because I saw so many Christians, so many, even just other people that weren't in the faith that would say, I want to change the nation, I want to change this, I want to change that. But it always came back down to, how are you going to change a nation that you don't understand? So I began hosting these meetings in my home, and eventually it grew, and I had the burning desire to create this into a nonprofit, which we just recently did. And we recently opened our digital platform. It was very hard to maintain We the People and all the progress that we were making while I was in school. So I'm very, very grateful for a digital interface and a digital platform to be able to share a little bit of what I learned and a little bit of what God puts in my heart to share and teach everyone. So that being said, we both, on behalf of We the People Institute, we thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that we were able to share and break down and simplify this in a manner that's easily understandable and tangible. So again, we are very open to your comments. And that being said, let's go ahead and get into the post-test. All right. So again, we're going to give you about 2 to 3 minutes to complete the post-test. It's the same amount of questions, same level of simplicity as the pre-test. Please be as honest as possible. Again, we really just want good, hard data and to know how we can improve in the future. Furthermore, after this online institute, you will be sent a survey to complete, letting us know how we did, if you have any recommendations in the future, how we can do better, what you liked, and again, what you didn't like. So please complete that as well. But for now, let's go ahead and excuse ourselves for about 2 to 3 minutes. Jonathan and I will be here if you have any questions before we get into the Q&A period, just any general questions. All right, we'll go ahead and do that now. All right, everyone, let's bring it back in. Was everyone able to complete the post-test survey? Everyone? Yeah. Great. Okay. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. Again, really, it makes it very helpful for the future. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. I just have one more thing. So a lot of you have asked me, how can we get involved with We the People Institute? And there are a few different ways that you can do that. So one of the ways, we really would love to start welcoming volunteers. So if you're a writer or if you have any specific skill sets that you feel could be valuable to the nonprofit, we would love to have you and we would love to have some time with you and get to implement your skill sets within our organization. So if you're interested, feel free to volunteer. Furthermore, if you really are passionate about making a nation where people are educated and engaged in government, which is our vision statement, and you want to partner with us in continuing to offer these free resources to people so that we can continue investing the amount of time that we really desire to with this organization, we encourage you to consider sharing a love offering. It's a donate to our organization. You can donate and you can sign up to volunteer. Both are incredible ways to get involved with We the People Institute, and you can do that by going on our website, and under the drop-down menu you can click Get Involved, and it'll take you to areas where you can volunteer, and it take you to a form where you can donate as well. One of the biggest things that you can do is help us spread the word by sharing, liking, and commenting on our posts on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We have all 3 profiles. You could leave a review on our Facebook page sharing your experience with this online institute or any of your live sessions or one-on-ones or reading the articles, anything to that nature, speaking to what you felt honest. We're looking for honest reviews. Another thing, like I said, we're going to send you a post survey. It's not the post test, it's a survey where you can give us feedback. We want to make this better for you. Finally, you could also subscribe on our website to our newsletter. We're going to start using that more. We're going to send you reminders for our blogs, send you exclusive resources, and